Good morning and good afternoon. Welcome to the Weekend Wellness Hour show. Very excited to have a new guest on who I met through a podcasting platform, and I was very fascinated by her bio. I was very fascinated about her bio and what she studies in the mental health world. She's an amazing history, and I went through her ebook, was able to see how she progressed her life into now studying quantum medicine and helping people in a very unique way in the mental health world. So thank you so much, Dr. Cristine Price, for joining us. Really excited to have you here today.
Thank you. I'm excited to be here and to explore this together.
Yeah, this is great. And so do you mind sharing with us a little bit about your background? Because you have quite a unique background and your experience really helps you connect with people.
I would love to. So if you don't mind, I'm going to kind of weave it in as we talk about the 4 bodies, 4 medicines. I also have 4 careers. So I'll kind of weave it all together. Yeah. So I started in the 90s. So actually, one of the things I have a PhD in natural medicine. I have a master's in psychology and licenses and all those fun things. But one of the things I'm most proud of is 33 years of recovery. So I got clean in 33 years and some go, but I went into my first career as a substance abuse counselor. And so as I worked with people in that field, I could see that there was a common theme, and that was basically self-medication. It was an effort for people to try to correct what was imbalanced. And so I started to study where does the imbalance come from and how do we really correct it? And I think that was the beginning of the Wellness Diamond, which, so I am an integrative mental health counselor, which what that means to me and to, those who talk about integrative medicine is that we're bringing together the 2 worlds, which is the Eastern and the Western, more or less. Eastern medicine and Western medicine can integrate and work together. And so in my first career, I was learning about natural solutions. And so that for me was amino acids, supplements, and nutritional neurochemistry and all that kind of fun stuff. Once upon a time when I was young, I wanted to be a biochemist. I didn't know what that was, but I thought it sounded cool. And so that was kind of how I became the biochemist, is that I started to learn how all of these things interact within the brain and the body and work together. And because a lot of times in the substance abuse world, taking more meds or taking more pills isn't the solution. So we've got to find that bigger solution. And so that's really what opened the door to looking at an integrative model. And
in your model, this diamond model, can you go through it? Because we're seeing now this shift in healthcare where it's not just one thing. You don't just address, your back. You have to look at the whole entire body. And with this model, that's what you do, and you do it for the mental health world. And I think it would be good to go through each of those bodies. If you could just share a little bit on each of the 4 bodies, and we can talk about them. And
so the Wellness Diamond has 4 points. So there's the physical, mental, emotional, and spiritual. And there's a lot of models out there that kind of look at all 4 of those. And so that addresses the mind-body connection. But the emotional side, it's interesting. So my second career, I went and because I figured out that by the time people are addicted to drugs, it's kind of too late to really change the system, at least easily, right? So my final year as a substance abuse counselor, I went into the prevention department and started working in high schools and teaching these high schoolers about the solution and, hey, let's figure this out before you get in too deep, So that inspired me to go into a different field when I got my master's degree, and that was school psychology. So I became a school psychologist. I worked in the school system with children and up to adolescence. I was in high schools and elementary schools, and I worked with severe behavior disorders. And my thesis was on emotional behavioral disorders. The first class in my master's program, I decided I wanted to explore emotional intelligence. And the professors did not like that. It was the only B I ever got. Everything else was an A. Only B I got was when I tried to explore emotional intelligence, because in the psychology department, they didn't measure emotions. They didn't really even talk about emotions. They talked about pathology, but they didn't talk about like emotional intelligence. And so that's what inspired me to figure out there is a difference between the mind and the emotions. Mm-hmm. And in psychology, they do interact, but you can't just work with one and not the other is really kind of what I found.
Interesting.
So the first year of my master's training, I also met a massage therapist who started teaching me about my chakra body. So this was something that we did not, I mean, you don't talk about emotions in the psychology department. Believe me, you do not talk about chakras, right? At least then. I don't know if they're talking about it now, but so when we talk about the four bodies, the first body is in the Western medicine field, the physical body. In fact, in the medical training, they're still using cadavers to study anatomy and organ placement and all those kinds of things, right? Well, what's missing in a cadaver if they're studying?
Emotional and spiritual. Yes.
Yes. And the life force, energy, the energy, right? The vital body. So that's the second body. So the second body combines, maybe all of these together, but it is what the Eastern medicine field studies or uses as the container of where the healing happens.
Okay.
And so the physical body is here and now, very present, very third dimensional, but the vital body starts to move into the invisible, if you want to call it that. Some people actually perceive it.
Right. And can you explain what you mean by the physical body exists in the three-dimensional? Just kind of go through what you mean by that.
Okay. So somebody who's really concrete is only perceiving the third dimension. People who are, who want evidence, or they want to be able to hold it and feel it and touch it. And, it's third dimensional if you can pick it up, like here's some supplements, Yep. It's third dimensional. I know I'm going to take a pill. And in fact, if you're going to work with the body in the third dimensional realm, I recommend supplements because it is, a natural way to intervene. But yeah, that's the physical world.
Thank you. I just wanted you to go through that for a second. Thank you.
And then the vital body is not measured and perceived in the same way as the physical world may perceive. And so you start to kind of move into the energetic. And so the vital body includes the chakra body, which a lot of people are aware of, where the chakras are aligned. And there's lots of different theories on how many we have, but there's a basic 7 chakra model that I work with. That goes from crown to root. And so kind of head to toe, more or less. And then the meridians, people are more familiar with that sometimes because acupuncture and acupressure, and there's, several different modalities that work with flows of energy. So those would be like meridians in traditional Chinese medicine. And that's also part of the vital body. So it was in 2003. So this was, I just gotten, I think, my first job as a school psychologist. And I learned about Gary Craig, who is the founder of EFT, Emotional Freedom Technique, the tapping technique. In 2003, nobody knew what that was.
Right.
And now they do, because Gary got it out there. His goal was to just spread it like wildfire, and it spread really well over the last 20 years. So I was one of his, one of the first people that went through his trainings back when he did them. And when I he didn't call it a certification, but when I completed the training, I realized, okay, now I need to use this and see what it can do. And I'll tell you a story of one of the students that I was working with came in. She was a 6th grader, And she had a lot of emotional excess. Some of us have emotional excess. Some of us have mental excess, right? And so mental excess looks a little different than emotional excess.
Okay.
Mental excess is we run things in our head and we get obsessive and we, go into anxiety mode because of what we're thinking. Emotional excess can be more limbic, is what they call it. So the limbic brain is where all this is emotional memories and triggers are held, and you get irrational and you just cry and or you scream or you just exude all these emotions and people don't know what to do with you. So that's really tough in a classroom for a teacher when somebody's doing that, right?
Right.
So this sixth grader was coming undone, and they brought her into my office, and she'd done this several times. They usually had to send her home to pull herself together. And in this, I usually only had a few minutes to work with. I never had like an hour. It wasn't like a therapy session. It was a few minutes that I could intervene. And so I had 15 minutes, maybe 20 minutes to work with her. And during that time, I used EFT. And I walked her through the tapping process, and I helped her breathe it out, and I helped her tap it out. And I kept her present, because what happens is when you tap, you're connecting those meridians back into that physical being, back into that first body, and using the basic body and breath to release emotion rather than putting it up here in the head, which is the third body, which we'll get to. So we're bringing her back into her body and releasing the emotion. And within 15 minutes, she smiled at me and she said, "Nobody's ever done that for me before. Thank you so much. I can go back to class now."
Yeah.
And it was miraculous.
That's amazing. And so I have a quick question regarding her. So when you go through a process like she did, how much of it carries over? So you were able to shift her, get her back into her physical body. So will she stay in that physical body for a while? And as she switches back out, do you just do this process over and over until she no longer needs to do it? Or is that something that she would need to do throughout her growth period and adulthood?
The fourth body will explain some of that when we get to that one. But so our patterning determines that. So some of that is physiological. Let's say, and knowing that she was 12 years old, knowing my story, okay, because my mental illness started in probably first grade, if not before. And by the time I reached puberty, which was 12-ish for me, sixth grade for me, I was a basket case, but I did it all up here. I didn't do it as an emotional release.
Okay.
So let's just say her patterning is around her menstrual cycles and all the changes that are happening hormonally. Most likely it'll probably come back out 30 days from now, right? Which is, that's a good theory on like why this kept showing up in bursts in her life. But that's one of those things that would need to be kind of established. And then if that's the case, there are solutions on these other levels that can correct it more permanently. But a lot of it is figuring out the patterning. And with PTSD or post-traumatic stress disorder, that patterning could be random rather than cyclic. And so it would depend on the triggers with that. Okay.
So you use the EFT, the tapping, to help with a vital emotional issue as well as physical issue. And there are other techniques within the emotional or vital body that you can use to help resolve those issues as well, right?
Yes. Okay. So Dr. Joe Dispenza talks about, he's done the book, Breaking the Habit of Being Yourself. And so sometimes our physical body, like with a hormone imbalance, is conditioned to repeat patterns. And sometimes it's the mental body. So I worked in school psychology for 10 years. I continued to do some substance abuse work as well. And so in this first kind of decade of my master's degree, I found really what became the frequency model. So I didn't know about Dr. Hawkins at the time, but I actually came by this 7 levels in a frequency model, which we progress through. And and I was like, oh my gosh, this is so cool, because it gave me a map of like where I was going in my own recovery and how to help kind of people through that. So some of what will change the patterning is if you raise your frequency. Mm-hmm. So that's kind of embedded in all of this as well. And so the patterning we have will show up, in our physical frequency. If our physical body is compromised, say by a really poor diet, a low frequency diet, or drug use, or, something low frequency, obviously it'll be harder to shift into these solutions. And so that was kind of the journey I was on during that time, is raising my own frequency and moving into higher awareness, self-awareness. So self-awareness kind of ties in with that third body. So the third body is the mental body. Mm-hmm. So in the psychology field, that's what they're trying to correct, is this mental body, is this stuff in our head. Mm-hmm. So I want to go back to the idea of dimensions. Okay. So when you're sitting in let's say you're sitting in your head. Let's start there. How many places can you go in your head?
Go forward, you can go backwards, you can
through time, right? You can go in the past, you can project the future, which is really where depression and anxiety come from. Right. And trauma comes from, and all these different, a lot of these different mental health conditions are because the mind is going places. Mm-hmm. It's going into what ifs, it's going into what you can't let go of, projecting worst case scenarios, or remembering trauma, or remembering, or just thinking yourself into a depression. You can do that, right? Have you found you can do that?
Yes. And when you perseverate on something from the past that didn't go the way you want, you can really put yourself in a bad mood.
You can totally. Yes. You can make yourself miserable, mm-hmm. and you can go into victim, and you can, go into attack mode in your mind. And yeah, I mean, the mind carries so much power over our well-being. And so so then my third career mm-hmm. is where I realized, okay, I can get so much accomplished with these kids, but their minds are only, like I'd figured so much out about like the frequency model and about all these avenues. I'm like, I really need to be able to teach adults, these principles. Mm-hmm. And so that was kind of where I really wanted to end up. Mm-hmm. And so I was able to get my license. It took me 10 years because school psychology is not the best route if you want to get a license in a mental health field. I discovered that. But it was really good to work with, this mm-hmm. early generation of and see the evolution of the disease model. So I ended up with my master's. So I had my master's in psychology. I ended up with my license so that I could be in private practice. Mm-hmm. So that was in about 2007. I got my private practice license. And then it was a gradual transition to my own practice, which I developed in about 2012. So with my own practice, I knew that I had the power then to bring all this together, because when I worked for other people, and the school was one of the first, it was kind of sad because I realized how much I could do with EFT with these kids, but I kind of felt nervous about it. And so I requested permission to use it, and it was denied. And then it was after that, I'm like, well, I guess I know the answer is no. Yeah. And then I went to work for a company that had grants and contracts with government agencies, and they had to be really careful about what they did there too. Right. So when I was on my own, I was like, all right, now I get to be whatever I am here to be. Right. Mm-hmm. So that was integrative mental health counselor, mm-hmm. is kind of what I gave, the title to what I was doing. So then I got to actually explore what was going on with an individual's chakra body when they were showing up with certain issues, and figured out that, okay, the second chakra is off when they have a whole history of hormone imbalance, mm-hmm. Or the fifth chakra, this is a big one, is off when they're caught in their negative looping in their mind, and they're hearing, the voice in their head is running them into the misery or the anxiety. So I was able to see the connection with the vital body and the mental body more as I worked with clients. And so I tried all kinds of different things. So EFT, I was trained in EMDR, which is the eye movement desensitization reprocessing.
Mm-hmm.
And I used a lot of these different really advanced tools to support clients to really get out of the patterning.
Right.
But it takes what I then learned eventually was a quantum shift, because our nature is to stay stuck. Our nature is to run the same old, same old. It actually takes a little bit of a miracle to shift that into a completely different frequency or solution.
Right. Because our nature is to find patterns and exist in our patterns to help calm our nervous system down. Because when we're faced with something new, that ramps us up. And so we constantly try to form a habit to calm ourselves back down. And so, which if the habits or the patterning isn't serving us, then that becomes a problem. And they need to see someone like you to help them transform and shift.
Yeah. And there's a lot of emotional work that goes into that to work that out. Changing thinking is great, but here's what I found. I refer to it as like trying to keep a 2-year-old in their car seat. Mm-hmm. So a 2-year-old is want their freedom. They want to, they're in their limbic brain, right? Mm-hmm. But they're also, they're not controlling their own experience yet. And so the mind will just kind of get hijacked all over the place with the limbic and its patterns. And so it's like trying to force the mind into one type of thinking. It's constant. It's like you're having to strap that thing back in every hour. It's a lot of work. And I found that I had some clients that saw me for 2 years because we would try all these different things, and it was a constant, like, well, let's try this way now. And, and I had a ton of also huge successes that were like major transformations. Mm-hmm. But I'm always about like, okay, give me a challenge so I can figure out like what's next. Mm-hmm. So I had some really challenging clients during that time.
And I imagine you learned a lot about that though. When you have really challenging clients, it helps you see things slightly different and start to figure out things a little bit different that helps maybe less challenging people.
Yeah, exactly. Yep. Yeah. And so as I was opening myself up to possibilities, I actually ran into my sponsor on a walk. So this was like around 2013, 14. Mm-hmm. And so this is kind of a fun part of the story, and I'm going to be writing a series of fiction novels, and it'll be in one of those, but I'd really shifted some massive things in the 90s and gotten out of some intense low frequency patterns. And this sponsor was huge. She changed my life. Meeting with her every week for a year, we finally shifted my auto patterns. And, in 12-step programs every week for 10 years. Well, not 10, but, off and on for 10 years. Yeah. So that was huge. That was my first quantum shift is what I would call it, was working with her. And when I ran into her, it had been like 10, 12 years since I'd seen her. And she told me that she had been following Thich Nhat Hanh. So if you know who Thich Nhat Hanh is, this is the famous Buddhist monk who has written, 20 different books on the power of, stillness and keeping the mind. And so what I discovered is that Buddhism was actually the solution for keeping that kid in there. And I shouldn't say car seat because those are buckled in, the high chair, right? Well, they can get out of, right?
Right.
So that was the solution. And our bodies and our minds just want to get out all the time. The trick is to get us in to our being in a way where we actually want to stay there. Yeah. So she introduced me so she actually told me there was a monk in her basement. So that I'm like, there's going to be a whole book called that, Monk in the Basement. But I actually got to meet with it's Nithya Shanti, who was a former Buddhist monk who came right to my hometown, little rural town in Cache Valley, Utah, and changed my life. so I got to meet with this individual for about 6 months and
Oh, wow.
experience this deep practice and principles on a level that I started to see the potential of meditation and a different mindset to create a permanent solution. So when I talk about the third body in my book, I really just hone in on meditation. There's 100 different, probably 1,000 different ways you could go about trying to change the mind. But the simplest is to just shut it up.
Yeah.
That's the simplest, just quiet it.
Mm-hmm. Which is hard. You know that. And
Yes, but if that's your goal, you'll get a lot further, I think, than trying to keep it in its seat.
Yeah.
So yeah. And so that was my exploration of that led me to Quantum University.
Okay.
So there's a fun story there. But as I figured out that what I was searching for wasn't something that I would learn in any traditional training. It was new. It was, and I kept being drawn to, when I hear about the 0 point field, I'd realize that's where the silence sits. How do we get there? Mm-hmm. And so I, just by orchestration and fun little miracles, I ended up enrolled in Quantum University. And so I worked on my doctorate in natural medicine over the last, well, it was 2015 to 2020 is when I got my doctorate. And so the journey of that 5 years was really my own meditation practice, as well as the understanding of the quantum mechanics of silence, more or less, and silencing the mind. And then where that can go to the next level, which is the fourth body, the quantum body.
Okay. So now those of us who are not as familiar with quantum body and this university, can you go into what do you mean by that?
Yes, it is a couple years worth of training, probably, that I'll try to put into a few minutes.
Okay.
So the term that I learned that really captivated me was the morphogenetic field. Mm-hmm. So the morphogenetic field is basically tied to our genetics, which would be DNA, but it's also information based. Okay. So our DNA is actually information based, and it isn't hardwired in that it's going to express itself consistently. You know, it's not like if you have this gene, you will get this disease, or if you have this gene, you will have, you know, so you can have like the genetic predisposition for something and not actually develop that disease. Mm-hmm. So that's where we start to look at epigenetics. Right. So epigenetics is really kind of the whole integrative body model, in that we can take something that is, you know, we're wired or programmed, if you want to call it that, to move into this disease, say, but we can shift it. We can turn it around. And really you need all four bodies to do that. So I kind of think of it as an overarching, you know, like information body that can send and receive. You know, it's like, we can tell that, you know, hey, my mind can tell this body, like, we are going to create this intention. And I remember I did that during this journey. I said, my hormones are in balance. And if you want to know my hormone story, okay. I had the most painful menstrual cycles at age 12, 13, 14, that when I went through childbirth, I didn't need meds. Wow. Okay. I was not medicated because it was only about 1 degree worse. Yeah. So that's how rough my hormones were. And I, you know, my parents tried to get me treated at age 16. They were taking me to specialized clinics to try to, and I was taking progesterone and different things to try to get that in balance. It was most of my life, I had hormone imbalance. And that leads to mental health issues and, you know, all kinds of stuff. So I decided, you know, I think it was 2016, I put it on my vision board. My hormones are in ideal balance. I am, you know, and I just made it like my intention. So that was information, right? So that was me saying, all right, morphogenetic field, attract in what will make this so. But the other thing I was doing during that time period was I was taking some formulas that are based on the quantum medicine principles. So quantum biofeedback is a quantum medicine tool. And so some people are familiar with biofeedback. It's evolved over the years and decades to where it is, you can work in the quantum space with it. They call it metaspace in the system that I have. And you're actually working with the information field. So I have a hormone panel, like on my biofeedback system, that will read the information on someone and say, these hormones are out of balance, and send Rife technology, so frequency technology back. So it can kind of go both ways. So we can communicate through that information field and correct things through that information field. These formulas are basically like a biofeedback session in a bottle. Okay. So you take a few drops and it sends that it creates that information balance. Okay. And if you add intention to it, you can amplify that. So that's what I started doing. So I started taking these formulas, and I can say I am truly in ideal hormone balance. And that is crazy to say when, I'm like now at the age of menopause, which could be a wild ride. And yeah. So it's a big deal to be able to say that's the case. Yeah. So that happened through, if you want to look at just the hormone piece, through this the information body saying, all right, we are going to create the balance. My mind also being in alignment with that and leaving the old patterns behind, using meditation and other tools to be with myself, right? Working through the emotions that come up in cycles, as a lot of women know that's when they come up. Yep. Yep. And, also understanding my second chakra more, which is where a lot of that's rooted. Okay. And then actually using, I use some bioidentical hormones. And so all that works together.
So you basically were doing some physical, some emotional work, some mental work, and then even quantum. Can you go into like how you tie that in, the spiritual?
Oh, yes. And the spiritual. So during, I don't know, the last 20 years, I've been a student of A Course in Miracles. Some people are familiar with that. So for me, that's like a spiritual piece that ties all this together. And then, and so we also have like a Miracles and Meditation group in my network, my community, where that's one avenue. I mean, there's so many different avenues you can go with the spirituality, but that is one that works really well with these principles for me personally, is to think in the miraculous realms, to work through the ego structures that get in the way of the solution. Because our own mind is wired to say, oh no, that probably won't work. Or what I've done for 40, 50 years is this. And so why would I can't change that. And so getting the ego out of the way with the mental body definitely comes through that as well. And, and having a community to connect to, I think is really important a lot of times for spiritual solutions, to be able to have support and to have, connection to others that, it's part of a bigger picture, really. Right. You find that.
Right. And so, and the spiritual can look towards even a religious.
It could. It could be religious
too, or it can be maybe non-religious. It can be any ways that allows you to connect higher. Is that correct?
Yeah. I'm very eclectic with my spiritual paths. And so, I'm Christian and Buddhist. In fact, so quantum wholeness meditation is the technique I developed to test. And so that's what I used in my dissertation. And I use that consistently as, a tool. And so the practice of that is, it basically allows us to, so what's unique about it, there's where I was going, is that it's a meditation for the the Eastern mind. So my background's more in Buddhism, but the Eastern mind and the Christian heart.
Okay.
So they work together. So yeah, so a lot of times people are kind of shy away from like the Eastern religions because they don't understand, like how does that fit in their, in our country still predominantly Christian. And, being able to bring those together in a way that also works with the healing is amazing.
That's incredible, because when we think of getting help in the mental health world, it's more about treatment, not necessarily about healing.
Yes, so, you don't hear the word healing. I never heard that word in my master's degree.
Right. So when someone does have a mental health concern, do you then say, okay, let's look at how do we work with you physically, emotionally, mentally, and then spiritually? And how would you approach someone on the spiritual aspect to work on this quantum body?
So on my website, and it's CristinePrice.com, no H in Cristine, which is interesting because I'm like, I am truly a Christian, but for some reason my parents decided not to put the H in my name. and that was part of my spiritual awakening actually 33 years ago, which is kind of a fun story. But it kind of walks you through some of those solutions that I offer. So I've narrowed it down to just a few different things. So EFT, the complete EFT method, is a tool that I like everybody to learn. And then quantum wholeness meditation training is something that I feel like, and I want people to have tools that they don't depend on the practitioner to provide. Like it's theirs. Once they learn it, it's theirs. And that's what's unique about EFT. And quantum wholeness meditation is you can meditate alone or you can meditate in a community, which we've developed. And so I do like 4 different meditation groups a week online that brings people right in. And in fact, sometimes that is the first thing I have people do because it starts to bring them into center enough to really hone in on like, what are the top solutions? Because, what I found is we can avoid a lot of dead ends if we can just get right to that center. And then frequency formulas. And so that's a trademark that I have on these, these actual, it's a quantum medicine. You can hold it in your hand. I had somebody pick them up, but yeah, they're just kind of like a homeopathy kind of approach.
Okay. So someone who needs to have a component of the quantum body and the spiritual body, they can do your quantum wholeness meditation. Which addresses both the mental and the quantum bodies. Or they can do the quantum medicine, which is the homeopathy medicine that also helps them use a physical means to tap into the spiritual. Is that correct? Yeah,
it works with that whole overarching, like, information body. So they start to attract the solutions like really quickly and effectively is what I've seen.
Okay. So it's nice to have both of those two together to help pull you into it. Okay.
Yeah. And then the emotional work, because a lot of times that's what the subconscious mind will derail you. So that's one way to get through all that.
That's great. And so someone who has maybe depression or anxiety, what will they start to experience and feel as they're going through this? Like, what are some common...
Well, I can give you like a couple stories, but one, so I had a client that I worked with that had to give up her internship because her depression was so bad. And it was on the East Coast and she came back to Utah and I worked with her for about 6 months and she was on medication and we worked on kind of the mental stuff and emotional a little bit, but it wasn't until she started the formula. So there actually is a formula for depression. She started that within a week. She went back to her doctor. So there's just synchronicity with it, which is, you just can't explain, but she starts the formula, goes to her doctor that week and gets her meds switched and boom, it was like, that was what she needed. So they may not experience like an etheric solution as much as they might experience a physical solution while taking these. And then she had them and that was like the timing was important because she had to figure it out that month, whether she was going to go back or not. So there's a God element to it. It's kind of like, pray for the answer, but also be where you're receiving it. Right. And so sometimes you got to clear your mind to receive it. sometimes there's emotions that have to get out of the way because you're holding on to old stuff.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, that's incredible. I really appreciate you sharing all this. And can you just remind us a couple what your website is and how people can find out about your meditation groups?
yeah, so CristinePrice.com is my website without the H again. And also I'm doing a free summit in July. It starts July 11th. And so if they want to get or 12th, if they want to get the 4 Bodies, 4 Medicines ebook, that's free on my website. And then I'll also give them the information to get on the free summit or get access to that.
Yeah.
And then www has to put the W's in front. amillionat1.com is where I have meditation groups. So for as low as like $27 a month, and you can come on regularly and get a lot of those solutions.
Okay. That's wonderful. Thank you so much for coming on today and sharing all this. Really appreciate it.
I appreciate the opportunity. Thank you. Yeah. Thanks for asking the questions.
No, this is great. And you bring a uniqueness to mental health and how you can address mental health concerns. So thank you for that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you. I'm very passionate about shifting that mental health paradigm so that we start bringing in spirituality, emotional healing, into that world where people are suffering. And that's really, it's time to end that suffering in a way that allows for these shifts and solutions to come forward.
Totally agree. Thank you very much. And thank you all for joining us today. Have a great and wonderful rest of your weekend. Happy 4th of July. And we will see you again next week. Bye now.
Thank you.